The first warning never came from the fire. It came from the dog. The late August afternoon settled gently over the mountain town of Cedar Ridge, Montana, where the scent of warm pine drifted through quiet streets and sunlight rested softly on white church steeples, family-owned diners, and rows of weathered wooden homes that had stood for generations. Children laughed from the small park near Main Street. Bicycles rolled lazily across cracked sidewalks, and pickup trucks eased through the only traffic light in town. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing sounded wrong. Yet nearly 2 miles beyond the western tree line, where dense ponderosa pines climbed toward the foothills, Police K-9 Atlas stood perfectly still. The 5-year-old German Shepherd had stopped in the middle of a routine search exercise beside Fire Captain Ethan Walker, his broad shoulders tense beneath his sable coat, amber eyes fixed toward the forest as though listening to something no human ear could hear. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The sky remained bright, washed in a peaceful blue with only a few scattered clouds drifting overhead. There was no visible smoke, no emergency calls, no alarms, just silence. "What is it, buddy?" Ethan asked quietly, resting a gloved hand against Atlas's neck. Instead of relaxing, Atlas released a low, uneasy whine unlike anything Ethan had heard from him before. It was not fear. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that had saved lives during countless rescue missions together. Ethan had trusted that instinct for 4 years, through flooded riverbanks, collapsed barns, and blizzard rescues where Atlas had found families buried beneath feet of snow long before thermal cameras ever could. Still, today felt different. Atlas stepped forward 3 paces, stopped again, lifted his nose into the warm breeze, and barked once. Loud, sharp, deliberate. Several volunteers loading hoses outside the Cedar Ridge fire station looked over with curious smiles. "Guess somebody spotted a squirrel," one of them joked. Ethan managed a faint grin, but Atlas never looked away from the distant hills. The breeze shifted, almost too gently to notice. Ethan caught the faintest trace of something unfamiliar beneath the scent of pine needles and dry grass. Not smoke exactly, more like overheated bark after a long summer drought. Before he could think further, Atlas barked again, louder this time, his body pulling firmly against the leash. A radio crackled on Ethan's shoulder. Dispatcher's voice. Calm. Routine. Station 1. Possible smoke report west of Miller Canyon. Single caller. Unconfirmed. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Miller Canyon lay directly where Atlas had been staring. Around him, life in Cedar Ridge continued without interruption. A waitress flipped the sign outside the cafe to dinner specials. An elderly couple crossed the street carrying grocery bags. Church bells echoed softly across town. The peaceful rhythm remained untouched, as though the entire valley had taken one slow breath together. Atlas suddenly lunged forward with surprising urgency. Ethan caught the leash just in time. The dog wasn't chasing anything. He was trying to reach something. Ethan looked back toward the horizon. This time he saw it, barely visible against the afternoon sky. A thin gray ribbon rising between the pines before disappearing into the sunlight. So faint that anyone else might have mistaken it for a passing cloud. Atlas let out one final bark that echoed across the quiet station yard. Within minutes, every life in Cedar Ridge would depend on the warning no one else had heard. The engines rolled out less than 2 minutes after the dispatch call, their flashing lights cutting across the peaceful streets while curious neighbors stepped onto porches, still believing the report would amount to nothing more than a small brush fire. Ethan kept one hand firmly on the steering wheel of the lead rescue truck, while the other rested briefly against the center console, where Atlas stood balanced with practiced confidence. The German Shepherd had not settled once since leaving the station. His ears remained forward, every muscle alert, his nose testing the air flowing through the slightly opened window. The farther west they drove, the stronger the dry wind became. It swept across open meadows and carried thousands of brittle pine needles over the pavement like tiny warnings no one had noticed until now. Captain Olivia Brooks glanced toward Ethan from the passenger seat, unfolding a topographic map across her knees. She was 39, calm under pressure, with years of wildfire experience written into every measured decision she made. "Weather Service just updated the forecast," she said quietly. Humidity dropped below 15%. Winds are increasing faster than expected. Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off the narrow highway. He had seen enough fire seasons to know how quickly ordinary afternoons could become historic disasters. Atlas suddenly shifted his weight and released another deep, restrained growl. Ethan slowed the truck. Ahead, the road curved around Miller Canyon, where towering pines formed a dense wall of green stretching toward the mountains. At first glance, everything appeared untouched. Then sunlight caught something unusual drifting above the trees. A thin column of gray smoke climbed steadily into the sky before flattening beneath the strengthening wind. "There it is," Olivia whispered. Dispatch crackled again through the radio. Additional callers reporting smoke. Residents near West Ridge Road advised to prepare for possible evacuation. Ethan pressed the accelerator. Within another mile, the scent became unmistakable. Dry timber, hot sap, faint ash carried on restless gusts that grew warmer with every passing second. Atlas stood taller, nose lifting repeatedly, as if piecing together an invisible trail. The rescue convoy reached a small overlook where the forest opened just enough to reveal the western valley. Every firefighter fell silent. Beyond the ridge, orange flames danced through the underbrush, still relatively low but moving with frightening speed as powerful winds pushed them uphill. Trees ignited one after another, not exploding with fury but awakening in waves, each flame passing quietly to the next like a line of lanterns carried through darkness. Ethan stepped from the truck, studying the terrain through binoculars. His expression tightened. The fire itself was not yet the greatest danger. The wind was carrying burning embers far beyond the main front, dropping them into untouched sections of forest closer to town. Atlas pulled gently toward an abandoned logging road nearly hidden beneath years of weeds and fallen branches. Ethan frowned. According to every modern map, that road had been closed decades earlier. Yet Atlas refused to move anywhere else. The German shepherd barked once, then looked directly back at Ethan with unwavering focus. Olivia lowered her map. "Do you think he found something?" Ethan remembered every impossible rescue they had survived together and clipped the leash into his hand. "Atlas has never asked me to follow him without a reason," he said softly. "Today is not the day I start doubting him." Atlas wasted no time. The moment Ethan loosened the leash, the German shepherd slipped onto the forgotten logging road with calm determination, weaving between tall weeds and weathered tree stumps as though he had traveled the path before. Ethan followed close behind, Olivia and two rescue firefighters only a few steps back, while the remaining crews began positioning engines along the canyon entrance. The old road disappeared beneath fallen branches and years of neglect, yet faint tire tracks, almost invisible beneath the dust, suggested that someone had driven through not long ago. The air grew noticeably warmer with every 100 feet. Pine needles drifted from the canopy above, carried by gusts that no longer felt refreshing but strangely dry, as though the forest itself had begun to lose its breath. Atlas suddenly stopped beside a rusted wooden sign lying face down in the brush. Ethan brushed away the dirt with his boot. The faded lettering read Cedar Ridge Youth Nature Camp. His heart tightened. The camp had officially closed nearly 10 years earlier after funding disappeared, but a local nonprofit occasionally reopened the cabins for weekend youth programs during late summer. Ethan looked toward Olivia. Was there anything scheduled this weekend? She reached for her radio, but before Dispatch could answer, a faint sound floated through the trees. Not the wind, not birds. A child's voice, barely audible. Then another. Atlas lifted his head instantly and barked once before sprinting deeper into the woods. Ethan ran after him, branches brushing against his sleeves as the scent of smoke thickened around them. Within moments, the trees opened into a small clearing where 6 aging log cabins surrounded an old dining hall. Thin ribbons of gray smoke drifted overhead, while tiny flakes of ash floated gently through the afternoon sunlight like quiet snow. A volunteer counselor stepped onto the porch, relief flooding her face the moment she recognized the rescue uniforms. She appeared to be in her early 30s, exhausted but composed, with soot lightly dusting her jacket. "Thank God you found us," she called. "Our phone stopped working over an hour ago." Behind her, nearly 24 children gathered near the cabin doors, their faces anxious but remarkably calm. Ethan quickly counted heads while Olivia confirmed the roster. 21 children, 3 adult volunteers. Everyone accounted for. Atlas moved among the children without hesitation, allowing a frightened little boy to wrap both arms around his neck for a brief moment before gently nudging him back toward the group. The dog's steady presence seemed to quiet fears that words alone could not reach. Ethan looked beyond the cabins toward the western ridge. The fire itself remained hidden by thick timber, yet the growing shower of embers told a different story. Burning debris was already falling into the surrounding forest, landing hundreds of yards ahead of the advancing flames. One spark in the dry grass would be enough. Dispatch finally answered Olivia's call. The weather update carried urgency that had not been present only minutes before. Winds had accelerated to nearly 30 miles per hour, pushing the wildfire east far faster than initial projections. Ethan studied the only paved road leading out of camp. Smoke was already drifting across it in uneven waves. He understood the truth before anyone spoke it aloud. If they waited even a few more minutes, that road could disappear behind fire and smoke. Atlas turned toward the eastern tree line, ears raised, body perfectly still once again. Then he looked back at Ethan with the same unwavering certainty that had brought them here in the first place. Whatever he sensed next had only just begun. The decision had to be made before fear had time to spread. Ethan gathered the three counselors beside the weathered dining hall while Olivia checked the latest wind reports. The numbers had become worse with every passing minute. Gusts now swept through the canyon with enough force to scatter glowing embers far ahead of the main fire. The forest no longer sounded peaceful. The gentle whisper of pine branches had become a restless roar, and the air carried a constant shower of ash that settled across cabin roofs like gray dust. Children instinctively looked toward the adults, searching every face for reassurance. Ethan knelt so he could speak at eye level with them. His voice remained steady, calm, and warm. Everyone is going home today. We are simply taking a different road than we planned. A few nervous smiles appeared. Atlas walked quietly through the group, brushing against small hands that reached for his thick fur. One little girl, no older than 8, wrapped both arms around his neck for a brief second before letting go. The German shepherd stood perfectly still, his calm presence doing what words alone could not. Olivia returned with a folded map and pointed toward a narrow service trail running east of the camp. The paved road may not stay open much longer, she said. But this old maintenance trail connects to County Road 12. It is almost 2 miles on foot. Ethan studied the map. The path crossed a shallow creek and climbed a gradual ridge before reaching open pasture. It would be slow with children, but it offered distance from the advancing smoke. Before he could give the order, Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears locked forward. His body stiffened. Then he trotted away from the group toward the edge of the clearing where dense trees concealed the beginning of the maintenance trail. Ethan followed. Beyond the first line of pines lay a fallen oak that had collapsed across the narrow path years earlier. Fresh scrape marks covered the trunk, and broken branches littered the ground. Atlas circled the obstacle twice before slipping through a small opening beneath the massive tree. Ethan crouched beside him and immediately understood. The gap was large enough for children to pass one at a time, but only if the adults cleared away the loose limbs first. "This is our way out," he called. Within moments, firefighters worked together to move smaller branches aside, while volunteers organized the children into pairs. No one raised their voice. Every instruction was spoken with quiet confidence, as though calm itself had become another rescue tool. As the first group prepared to enter the trail, a distant rumble echoed across the hills. It was not thunder. It was the sound of dry timber surrendering somewhere beyond the western ridge. More ash drifted overhead, and sunlight faded into a strange copper glow. Ethan glanced back toward the camp one last time. The cabins still stood peacefully among the trees, looking almost untouched, yet the changing wind carried the unmistakable scent of burning pine much closer now. Atlas stepped onto the trail, paused, and looked over his shoulder to make certain every child had begun following. Only after the smallest pair entered safely behind him did the German shepherd continue forward, leading the entire line into the forest, one careful step ahead of the danger that was silently closing the distance. The narrow maintenance trail twisted through towering pines that had stood for generations, their trunks rising like quiet pillars beneath a sky that had begun to disappear behind layers of drifting smoke. Every few steps, Ethan glanced over the line of children, counting them again and again without thinking. 21 children, 3 counselors, Olivia, 2 firefighters bringing up the rear, Atlas leading from the front. Everyone still together. The little creek marked on the old map appeared sooner than expected, its shallow water flowing gently over smooth stones that reflected the strange orange light filtering through the smoke above. The cool sound of moving water offered a brief sense of peace, and several children smiled for the first time since leaving camp. Ethan allowed himself one careful breath. Then Atlas stopped. The German shepherd stood at the edge of the creek with his nose lifted high into the wind. His tail became perfectly still. His ears shifted once toward the eastern ridge instead of the fire behind them. Ethan had learned long ago that Atlas never hesitated without reason. Before anyone could speak, the dog crossed the creek in 3 effortless strides and disappeared into a stand of thick cedar trees bordering the trail. "Atlas," Ethan called firmly. The dog did not return. Instead, a single bark echoed through the forest, followed by another several seconds later, farther uphill. Olivia looked toward Ethan with concern. "That is not his search pattern." Ethan nodded. "No, he is calling us." Leaving one firefighter to supervise the children, Ethan and Olivia followed the sound through the cedars. The ground climbed gradually until the trees opened onto a forgotten gravel service road hidden beneath years of moss and fallen branches. Rusted maintenance signs leaned crooked beside the path, nearly swallowed by vines. Ethan stared in disbelief. According to every current emergency map, this road no longer existed. Yet it stretched east across open terrain toward County Road 12, far wider and safer than the narrow hiking trail below. Heavy rescue vehicles could even travel across sections of it with minimal clearing. Atlas stood 50 yards ahead, waiting quietly beside an old steel gate hanging open on broken hinges, as though he had simply been leading them towards something he already knew they would need. Olivia unfolded the map again, tracing the faded topography with one finger. "This road is not here," she whispered. Ethan looked beyond the gate toward the broad gravel path winding through open pasture where the wind carried far less smoke than inside the forest. It was more than an escape route. It was the fastest possible way to move every child to safety. He pressed the emergency radio against his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Captain Walker. I need every available evacuation bus redirected to the abandoned Forestry Service road east of Miller Canyon. Coordinates incoming." A brief silence followed before the dispatcher answered. "Captain, that road was listed as permanently closed years ago." Ethan looked at Atlas, whose steady amber eyes never left his face. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth despite everything surrounding them. "Then today," he replied softly, "it is open again." Within 12 minutes, the first evacuation buses appeared through the haze, their headlights glowing softly beneath the copper-colored sky as volunteer deputies cleared the forgotten forestry road with chainsaws and pickup trucks. Drivers who had lived in Cedar Ridge their entire lives admitted they had never known the road still existed. One by one, the children climbed aboard, each pausing to smile or wave at Atlas before finding a seat by the windows. The German shepherd moved alongside every bus with quiet patience, watching carefully until each door closed. Ethan counted again as he always did. 21 children, 3 counselors. Every name answered. Every seat filled. Relief settled over him for only a moment before another urgent message came across the radio. "Captain Walker, multiple neighborhoods on the western edge of town have begun voluntary evacuation. Winds have shifted again." Ethan looked toward the horizon where the smoke had thickened into a towering gray curtain stretching across the valley. The fire itself remained hidden behind the ridges, yet glowing embers drifted through the air like tiny stars carried by an unforgiving wind. Olivia climbed into the command vehicle to coordinate incoming resources while Ethan remained beside the final bus, watching it disappear safely toward County Road 12. Atlas stood quietly at his side, breathing a little harder now after miles of guiding frightened children through rough terrain. Ethan knelt and poured fresh water into a collapsible bowl from his emergency pack. Atlas drank only a few careful mouthfuls before lifting his head again. His attention shifted immediately toward the abandoned camp they had left behind. The dog stared so intensely that Ethan instinctively followed his gaze. Everything should have been finished. Every cabin had been searched. Every roster confirmed. Still, Atlas would not look away. He circled once, then returned to the same position facing west. His ears stood forward. His body remained perfectly still. Ethan recognized the behavior immediately. Atlas was not confused. He was searching for something his senses insisted was still unresolved. Ethan spoke softly into the radio. Dispatch, confirm once more. Cedar Ridge Youth Nature Camp. 21 children. 3 adult counselors. Is that complete? Papers shuffled on the other end before the dispatcher answered. Stand by. Several long seconds passed. Ethan could hear only the wind brushing across dry grass and the distant hum of engines gathering below the ridge. Then the reply came, quieter than before. Captain, records indicate 1 volunteer maintenance caretaker was assigned to inspect the property this morning. Male, 68 years old. Name, Harold Bennett. We have not made contact. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Atlas gave a single low bark before turning toward the forest without waiting for another command. Ethan stood immediately, fastening the leash to his belt only long enough to gather his equipment. Olivia stepped out of the command vehicle after hearing the transmission. The buses are moving. The children are safe. Ethan nodded. But someone may still be out there. Olivia looked toward the darkening woods where smoke continued to drift between the pines. She understood before he finished speaking. Atlas had known it long before any official record revealed the missing name. The German shepherd had never stopped searching because, somewhere beyond the trees, one quiet heartbeat had not yet made it home. Atlas disappeared into the drifting smoke with the silent confidence that had become his signature through years of rescue work. Never rushing, never hesitating, simply following a trail that only he seemed able to understand. Ethan stayed close behind, every step measured across the uneven forest floor, while Olivia coordinated with the remaining firefighters over the radio. The forgotten camp lay strangely quiet now, its empty cabins standing beneath a sky that had darkened from afternoon gold to an uneasy amber glow. Ash floated gently between the trees, settling across weathered roofs and worn picnic tables where children had laughed only an hour earlier. The stillness felt almost sacred, broken only by the distant murmur of the growing wildfire somewhere beyond the western ridge. Atlas slowed beside the old maintenance shed near the edge of the property. The wooden building leaned slightly with age, its faded green paint peeling beneath decades of harsh Montana winters. He circled it once, then twice, nose close to the ground before stopping beside a narrow side entrance partially hidden by climbing ivy. Ethan reached the doorway and noticed something immediately. Fresh boot prints marked the dusty threshold. Someone had entered recently. He called out in a calm, steady voice. Mr. Bennett, this is Fire Captain Ethan Walker. If you can hear me, answer back. At first there was only silence. Then, almost too faint to recognize, came the gentle tapping of metal against wood. Atlas's ears lifted instantly. He barked once and pressed his shoulder against the weathered door. It opened only a few inches before stopping against something heavy resting behind it. Ethan and one firefighter carefully pushed together until the gap widened enough to slip inside. The cool darkness smelled of cedar lumber, old tools, and faint smoke drifting through cracks in the walls. Near the back of the shed sat Harold Bennett, exactly where the dispatcher had believed he might be. The elderly caretaker, with silver hair beneath a worn baseball cap and kind blue eyes clouded by exhaustion, smiled weakly the moment he saw Atlas. I figured somebody would come, he said quietly. I just did not expect the dog to find me first. Ethan knelt beside him. Harold explained that while inspecting storm damage beneath the building, an old storage cabinet had shifted, blocking the narrow exit before he could move it alone. His handheld radio had stopped working hours earlier, and thick smoke outside convinced him that remaining calm inside the sturdy shed was safer than wandering blindly through the forest. Ethan checked him carefully. He appeared tired and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. Relief washed over the room so gently that no one spoke for several seconds. Atlas walked forward and rested his head against Harold's knee. The elderly man smiled through moist eyes as his weathered hand disappeared into the thick fur behind the German shepherd's ears. Good boy, he whispered. You never gave up on an old man. Outside, the wind strengthened again, carrying more ash across the clearing. Olivia's voice came over the radio with renewed urgency. Fire crews had successfully slowed the Western advance long enough to secure the evacuation routes, but conditions continued changing by the minute. Ethan helped Harold carefully to his feet, while firefighters cleared the remaining debris from the doorway. As they stepped outside together, the first rays of late afternoon sunlight briefly pierced the smoky sky, casting soft beams across the camp one final time. Ethan looked toward Atlas, who paused only long enough to glance back at the silent cabins before leading them once more toward the hidden forestry road. The German shepherd did not carry medals or speak heroic words. He simply kept walking, making certain that this time every single soul was coming home. By early evening, the last evacuation vehicle rolled safely into Cedar Ridge, carrying Harold Bennett beside two exhausted firefighters, while Atlas rested quietly at Ethan's feet, his amber eyes still watching the western hills as though his work was not yet finished. The town had changed in only a few hours. Streets that had been filled with afternoon laughter now stood lined with emergency vehicles, volunteers distributing bottled water, church members opening fellowship halls, and neighbors welcoming families they had never met before. Fear had arrived quickly, but kindness had moved even faster. Ethan stepped from the rescue truck and removed Atlas's working harness, brushing away the fine layer of gray ash that had settled across the German shepherd's thick coat. Atlas leaned gently into his hand for only a moment before turning back toward the busy command center. Even without the harness, he remained on duty in his own quiet way. Children recognized him immediately. Several ran toward him with careful excitement, stopping just short until Ethan nodded with a smile. Atlas greeted each child with calm patience, accepting gentle hugs and small hands resting against his shoulders. The little boy who had held on to him at the camp earlier knelt beside him once again. "I knew you would come back," he whispered softly. Atlas answered only by resting his muzzle against the boy's arm, a simple gesture that carried more comfort than any promise could have offered. Nearby, Harold Bennett spoke with reporters who asked how he had managed to remain so calm while waiting alone. The elderly caretaker smiled and looked toward the German shepherd instead of the cameras. "I never believed I was forgotten," he said quietly. "Somewhere out there, that dog was already looking for me." His words spread through the gathering crowd more quickly than any official announcement. Volunteers who had never met Atlas before walked over simply to thank him. Firefighters from neighboring counties removed their helmets for a moment as they scratched behind his ears before returning to work. No one called him extraordinary. They simply treated him like another member of the team who had earned every quiet gesture of respect. As darkness settled across the valley, cooler air finally arrived from the north. The fierce winds that had driven the wildfire through the afternoon began to weaken, allowing containment crews to strengthen protective lines around the western ridge. Dispatch confirmed encouraging news over the radio. The evacuation had been completed before the fire reached the outer neighborhoods. Homes had been protected, families had been reunited, and not a single life had been lost during the emergency. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, offering a silent prayer of gratitude that needed no audience. He looked down at Atlas, who had curled peacefully beside the command trailer after one long day of guiding strangers toward hope. The German shepherd had never asked for applause, recognition, or reward. He had simply trusted what his heart and senses had told him from the very first uneasy bark beneath the quiet afternoon sky. Around them, the lights of Cedar Ridge slowly came back to life, glowing warmly against the mountain darkness like gentle reminders that even after the longest day, hope still finds its way home, sometimes carried not by words, but by 4 faithful paws. The sunrise that followed arrived quietly, spilling soft bands of gold across the mountains surrounding Cedar Ridge as though the valley itself had been given permission to breathe again. The sharp scent of smoke had faded into the clean fragrance of damp pine carried by the cool morning air, and for the first time since the long afternoon began, silence returned without fear hiding inside it. Along Main Street, shop owners swept away the thin layer of ash that had settled overnight, while neighbors greeted one another with grateful smiles that needed very few words. Life had not returned because everything was untouched. It had returned because everyone who mattered had come home together. Outside the fire station, Ethan Walker sat alone on the wooden steps with a warm cup of coffee resting beside him. Atlas lay comfortably at his feet, His powerful frame finally relaxed after the longest rescue of his career. The German shepherd slept deeply, paws twitching now and then as if quietly revisiting yesterday's journey through the forest. Ethan watched him for a long moment before reaching down to scratch gently behind his ears. Atlas opened one eye, lifted his head, and leaned into the familiar touch before settling back down with complete trust. No words were spoken. None were needed. Later that morning, the people of Cedar Ridge gathered in the town square, not for a celebration, but for something simpler. They wanted to say thank you. Children arrived carrying hand-drawn pictures of a brave German shepherd leading smiling families through tall pine trees. Volunteers placed homemade pies on folding tables beside fresh coffee, while local musicians played gentle acoustic hymns beneath the old maple trees. Harold Bennett stepped forward carrying a small wooden plaque he had carved by hand before the ceremony began. The smooth piece of cedar bore only a few carefully engraved words. For Atlas, who listened before the rest of us heard. Harold handed it to Ethan, but the fire captain quietly knelt and rested the plaque against the ground in front of Atlas instead. The crowd smiled. Somehow that felt exactly right. There were no grand speeches and no dramatic applause. The deepest gratitude often arrived in quieter forms. A little girl tied a blue ribbon gently around Atlas's collar. The young boy who had whispered to him at the camp simply hugged his neck once more before walking back to his parents with peaceful eyes. Firefighters from neighboring counties shook Ethan's hand, but every one of them paused to thank Atlas as well. Before leaving, Olivia stood beside Ethan and looked toward the western hills where faint wisps of white smoke still drifted above the distant trees. "You trusted him before anyone else did," she said softly. Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off his partner. "He trusted something greater than fear," he answered. "I only chose to follow." The church bell echoed across the valley as another ordinary morning began. Pickup trucks rolled through familiar streets. Children laughed on their way to school. Storefront doors opened once again beneath the bright Montana sky. Cedar Ridge would remember the day the fire came. But even more than that, it would remember the quiet courage that walked ahead of everyone else without asking to be noticed. Some heroes carry radios. Some wear heavy boots. And sometimes, when grace chooses the gentlest path, it arrives on 4 steady paws, looks toward the horizon long before anyone else, and reminds an entire town that hope often speaks in silence before the world is ready to listen.